Perfect. Let me actually start by thanking you, Shamal, for the invitation. It's and Robert for the organization. It's great to be here. It's great to share with Bina. Both, I have never met you, and again, I will not count this as totally meeting you. So I hope to actually be Manchester sooner rather than later when the world is in a different state. I should start by a warning or an apology in a way, which is for a variety of reasons, including that being head of department this year is not the easiest job ever. I haven't actually done research on this topic as much as, for example, Ken, I know, has done. So my comments are very much an invitation for all of us to discuss issues that I know some of you will actually have explored and done more research on. So it's very much about promoting a conversation as much as telling you a lot of new information. And to do so, I'm going to focus on topics I know a little bit more about. So I'm very much going to think about inequalities at different levels and focus on the example of Latin America, although I think some of the things I'm going to talk about and say will be relevant for other parts of the global South. I want to very much think about the two big levels of inequality. One is international inequality in Branko Milanovic definition, so very inequality between countries and especially between the global North and global South. Then to make a reference to inequality within Latin America and what has happened in that front. And as I say, my goal is to very much suggest areas for conversation that I hope others can pick up later. So let me start with the inequality between Latin America and the global North. So in some ways, what we can talk is about a narrow definition of convergence. And if you take that, Latin America, contrary to other parts of the world, will clearly diverge. And the crisis and COVID-19 is going to clearly lead to a divergence in terms of GDP per capita. This is partly a result of the fact that the region had already been suffering. So in the last 5 years, Latin America has had another lost decade. For those of you that don't work in Latin America, we have a lot of lost decades or have lost decades in the region at different points. And it's very likely that it will extend. And it's very likely because according to IMF numbers, Latin America has actually suffered a bigger recession than any other region in the world, with the exception of the European Union, and will have a slower recuperation next year than the European Union. And that has major political and social implications. It has on the myth of convergence, which I think it's one that is in big crisis in the region, contrary to the same narrative in East Asia in particular, but also in terms of how to understand many of the political events that are taking place in the region. Of course, for many people in the room that are non-economists and that are very much working on international development, the issue is not about the narrow definition of convergence, but I think a broadly debate about what North and South mean and what's the validity of the North and South divide. As many of you know, the concept itself of development studies, of international development, and the separation between global North and global South has been questioned for the last 2 decades, if no more. In fact, some of people in Manchester has made a major contribution. Rory Horner, who I don't know if it's in the call, has just written a very nice paper on precisely the questioning of international development and thinking about global development, very much around the idea that globalized capitalism is much more interconnected than before, that there's a blurring between the North and the South, and also that there's a lot of global problems that require global solutions. So I want to take that framework to think for 2 or 3 minutes on how much this crisis actually reinforces the need to abandon the global North versus global South separation versus how much it actually questions that abandonment. And I actually have to say that in some ways, Ken will be present because this is an ongoing discussion with Ken Shadlin himself. In some ways, the first reaction that many people have is that this was very much a global crisis with consequences that show the interconnectedness of capitalism and that affected as much the global north and the global south. At the end, it's a crisis that was took place in China. It moved to Europe through the channels of tourism and trade, so very much the types of globalized capitalism channels, and that then has affected the global north and the global south nearly as much. If you go to the list of the 10 countries with the highest numbers of deaths, 5 are from the global south: the US, UK, France, Italy, and Spain, while another 5 are outside the global north, are from outside the global north: Brazil, India, Mexico, Iran, and Russia. And of course, as I'm sure you have debated and discussed in previous sessions, so far, the African continent has been less affected, at least in terms of deaths, with only South Africa being in the top 30 countries in terms of number of deaths. So in some ways, some people and some of you will see this crisis as a reinforcement of the importance of global development over other notions. But actually, in other ways, there are several phenomena that reemphasizes the importance of the structural inequalities and hierarchies in the current global world. And I think 2 are particularly clear to emphasize the separation, for example, of Latin America from other parts of the world, while I acknowledge, of course, that the place of China in this, in what I'm going to say, is much more complicated. The first have to do with the access to vaccines themselves. And again, I know this could be something that Ken has explored and could discuss better than I do. In some ways, the vaccine has been like a lottery, as you know, in which different countries bought more or less tickets, depending on how much they could afford the price of the ticket. And that has meant that while in most of Latin America and many other parts of the global south, the evolution of the Astra-Oxford vaccine is the key, because actually there has been more than 3 billion requirements to buy that vaccine. Countries in the global south have diversified much more which vaccines they were purchasing. And that has a lot to do, of course, with the cost. As you know, the Oxford Astra vaccine will cost around $4 to $5 because that was the commitment made at the beginning, while the other ones, the one by Pfizer and BioNTech, for example, it's going to cost around $20, $40. And even if the price in some countries in the global south will be lower, clearly access has been much more limited. So I think it's impossible to think about vaccines without thinking about the hierarchy in the global economy and its implications. Of course, the other area where I work more and I follow more closely has to do with financial policy and the potential for expansionary policies in the current global economy. So many of you know that famously the IMF chief, when talking to the IMF, said, and I quote, "I don't know how many times I would go publicly and I would say, spend, keep the receipts, but spend." So there's this rhetoric that has become very popular, that the IMF has shifted, that the World Bank has shifted, and that we are now in a non-austerity type of fiscal policy where all countries are being encouraged to spend. The reality is, of course, very different, is that this has actually been taken on by the European Union and especially the US very enthusiastically, but that in the country that I work on, we are moving very rapidly to the politics of austerity. This is very evident, for example, in Ecuador, which was forced to sign an agreement with the IMF that had many of its traditional components, not only in terms of fiscal policy, but also in terms of labor policy as well. In the case of Costa Rica, a country I work a lot on, it's a country that is talking about austerity because of a very high public deficit, even if public debt is actually much lower as percentage of GDP than in many other parts of the world, including the country I come from, Spain. So I think the COVID-19 crisis is a huge invitation to see how, in my view, we need to move our study of development to both embrace the global nature of the problem, but at the same time maintain some of the traditional hierarchies that structuralism had between center and periphery. So that's the first big idea that I wanted, and I can imagine how many different views people will have about this. The second, I want to move to inequality within countries briefly. And before I discuss the actual impact, make a broader analytical claim, which is, I think we have to abandon for clearly and forever the notion of inequality that sometimes neoclassical economists use as simply the difference between income levels of different people in the population based on measures like the Gini. So if you think about the Gini, and when we talk about its statistical properties, we are very proud of the fact that a change in distribution between the in the middle of the distribution has the same implications on the number that at the top of the distribution. And basically what I want to argue is that when we talk about income inequality, we are talking about two different processes that we should clearly distinguish. The first is concentration of income at the top. So this is the idea that obviously Piketty has made popular, but also the work of Gabriel Palma at Cambridge, that inequality is very much about the rich becoming richer and the political, social, and economic implication that this has. So that's one way of thinking about this. The other is about thinking about labor, specifically labor inequalities, and here to think about the different opportunities that different people with different jobs have in the labor market. And again, I think too many times when we discuss inequality, we are mixing those two things, or we are making claims about one that really refer to the other, and it's important that we separate. So what has been the implications of COVID-19 in both of these types of inequality? The answer is I don't think we know yet very well, but in principle, I think both of them have been relatively negative. So for all we know, the concentration of cap income at the top is likely to intensify in many parts of Latin America through at least two different channels. The first is the stock market channel. Many of the elites in Latin America, this is very clear, for example, in Central America, sold many of its actual interest, productive interest, and became investors. And became investors with a global strategy, and therefore became investors that have benefited very significantly with the quick recuperation of the stock market, particularly in the global north. So as you probably know, the S&P 500 lost significant value in March or April, but by June had already recuperated 60% of its value, and currently is back to higher numbers than at the beginning of the year. And this has obviously had major implications on investors. Why and how do you explain this increase in the stock market? It's fairly clear that this has a lot to do with increase in with the monetary policy and the increase in liquidity that has taken place all across the world, including in Latin America. But the second channel is that many of the responses that countries have adopted in terms of the small fiscal expansion that has taken place on the protection of jobs have taken place in the formal sector and have obviously taken place in large companies more than in small ones. This has to do, for example, with the reduction on the value-added tax that took place across the region, and that, of course, affects and benefits much more large firms than small ones. It also has to do with the fact that the main employers in the formal sector, not as a whole, but in the formal sector across Latin America, are the largest firms. So for example, in Mexico, 20 companies generate around only 20 companies generate around 2 million jobs. So around 10% of total formal jobs in the economy. And therefore, there's a tendency to protect those that are too big to fail, if I can use the banking analogy. So I think the story of concentration will be quite negative and is likely to intensify in the next few years, with only one very positive point that I want to discuss, and where actually I think some Latin American countries might be at the forefront of the debate, and is the renewal attention to wealth taxes. So as you might have heard, Argentina has been one of the few of the first countries that have now implemented a wealth tax. It just approved it last week, very much in line with some of the conversations that the work again of Piketty, Saez, and others had put. So it has created a one-time wealth tax on people whose assets are above 2.5 million people. $1 million, sorry. This is only 12,000 people. So I don't think the increase in income will be nearly as significant as some of the proponents want. But I think the signaling effect of the wealth tax will be extremely important because it reinforces the notion of solidarity, given that much of this tax is going to be spent in global supplies, in a scholarship for children, and in social development. So it reinforces this narrative that I think is very important of the wealthy having to pay for some of the cost. I haven't looked at the time, Shamil, so I don't know if I have 3 or 4 more minutes. Or...
Yeah, that's fine. You could take 3 or 4.
Perfect. Yeah, that's fine. So then in terms of concentration, I guess 3 messages. Those of us that work on inequality, I think, must pay a lot of attention to this part of the income distribution. When we do, we have not a lot of data on what is happening, but the data we have would indicate that the wealthy will suffer less than other groups. But at the same time, this very exciting agenda around income redistribution and around wealth taxes in particular. So let me move now to my last element about effects, which has to do with inequality in the labor market. And of course, we know here that the story is that not so much about COVID as a health crisis, but COVID as an economic crisis. Latin American countries actually impose longer lockdowns than anywhere else in the world. And that had very different implications of different groups of the population. It primarily affected, of course, those sectors that depending on very direct relations with clients, with customers, and those that couldn't use the online resources to continue working. Of course, we know that some of those services that are very customer phase, which have to do with trade, have to do with hospitality, etc., are sectors dominated both by relatively unskilled, low-income jobs and also by females. And in that sense, we already have some statistics on the very negative impact on both low-income formal jobs and also informality. Some of the numbers that we know is that around 30 million people lost their job in Latin America, again, primarily in these groups. We also know that poverty rates have increased very significantly. So around 28 million people in Latin America have become part of the poor in the last 8 months. 4 percentage points more than at the beginning of the year. So at the moment, the poverty rate has gone up to 35%, making a return to probably 5 or 6 years ago. So a lot of the losing a lot of the gains that had taken place recently. I think in this area, the story that I have described is dramatic, but nothing that all of you don't know, and that is not affecting other countries, including actually the UK. What is extremely interesting from those of us that are comparative political economists, and also for those of us that work on social policy, is the different responses that different countries have had, which have been to a large extent independently of their fiscal space. And here I think the difference between the two largest countries in Latin America are particularly interesting. So basically, Mexico did nothing or did very little to respond to the crisis because it was hugely concentrated on maintaining a relatively healthy fiscal position. While in Brazil, the Brazilian government adopted a relatively active policy, primarily in terms of transfers, not so much because Bolsonaro suddenly had become very worried about the poor, but because Congress forced him to implement some of these policies, and then he embraced it for electoral reasons, and we can discuss that more in questions and discussion. So just to give you some indications, after the policies of expansion of cash transfers, in Brazil, 62% of households with children currently receive a cash transfer, compared to only 17% in Mexico, 62 versus 17. And in terms of sufficiency of the transfer, the amount of cash transfer received by households with 2 children in Brazil is equivalent to 70% of the poverty line, versus 20% in Mexico. So these are huge differences with very significant implications on people's lives, even if even the Brazil support is clearly insufficient and is clearly has not done enough to reduce poverty. So 2 last things that I want to say. The last one on this issue of inequality is that, of course, part of the dramatic implications of this crisis is not just the short-term implications, but the long-term implications through education. So the impact of the lockdown in Latin America has been extreme and has been particularly large for low-income individuals. So some estimations assume that the learning gap between those at the top of the income distribution and those in the lowest 2 deciles has been increased by 25% since the crisis. And very interesting work from the IDB show that the implications are likely to intensify because of the reduction in education spending in the future. I think here the comparisons with the debt crisis of 1980s is very interesting. When we think about the generation that was in secondary school in particular, or was about to enter into secondary school in the mid-1980s, we see that all of those did not finish, or many of them did not finish secondary school in countries like even Costa Rica, one of the most developed in the region, and suffer in terms of income levels for the whole 1990s and 2000s. I'm afraid that that will be exactly the same implications, that we have a whole generation of young people between the ages of 8, 9 to 16, 17, which are going to suffer through a much worse incorporation in the labor market in the last decade or 15 years, unless something happens. This is a moment where I conclude, and I should always conclude by saying that crises are windows of opportunity, and that, of course, there's all kinds of things that could happen more positively if we use this opportunity. Actually, I don't think looking at the world from December, that's the right question. The right question is not whether this is a window of opportunity or not, but under what conditions this can be a window of opportunity, and under what conditions there might be some optimism in terms of things changing in the region. What are the key actors and the key processes that could lead to things being slightly better that I have discussed in the 1, 2, or 3 years ahead? And for me, although obviously this will require a lot of discussion in questions and answers, 3 variables are particularly important. First is the role of social movements. Will social movements play an active role, and especially will this just be just spontaneous protests like we see in Guatemala, or will they push an agenda for change as we see in Chile? So the extent, but also the agendas that they have is important. Second, how much will be the capacity of the political system to respond? And in particular, will we have a strengthening of political parties that are linked to those social movements? And will we see or not a renewal of the left? And third, even if I'm normally a political economist much more based on interest than ideas, I do think that ideology and ideological and ideas debates will be very important in the years ahead. And in particular, how we are able to frame the crisis is something under contention for the next year. And just to be very simplistic, I think we have, in some places and by some institutions, this already being framed as a fiscal crisis with social consequences, while obviously what we all want, I think, in this audience, is to frame it as a social crisis that will have fiscal consequences, but more importantly, will have and is having huge negative implications in people's lives. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks a lot, Diego. That was excellent overview of a lot of issues, I think. Just to kind of take some of the key points, I think. So one of the key points that if we look, tell me if I'm wrong, is that if we look at between country inequality, you're arguing we're going to see an increase as a result of vaccine access and of fiscal space ability in the more advanced economies. And if we look at within country inequality, you expect some sort of an expansion of inequality, driven by issues around formal, informal sector, and driven also by issues around wealth and the ability to move wealth across countries, invest in the stock market and the advanced economies, etc. Is that kind of the main 2 dynamics, I guess? Yeah. Okay. So I'm sure there are a lot of people who will have points, comments, questions, but I don't want it to be only directed at Diego. So I'll ask Bina to make her opening intervention too, and then hopefully we could bring back the 2 and then have questions discuss together. Okay, Bina.
Thank you, Shamel, for organizing this, for inviting me, and thanks also to Rob. And Diego, that was an amazing sweep from the macro to the micro to social movements. I don't know if I can, I won't even try that sweep. What I will be doing is really talking, but I will be talking about inequalities. I will go much more micro, much more focused on the human face. You know, where I agree is that with a lot of things. So COVID-19 has brought what I have termed development reversals. In particular, the dramatic gains in reducing poverty in the last decade, especially in China and India, are being reversed. And the recent World Bank estimates were that 88 million will be added just this year to extreme poverty globally, a large part of it in India. But even among the poor, of course, there is inequality, and especially by gender. And what I will be then talking about is the deepening gender inequalities due to COVID-19. But I will also talk about the transformative potential that rural women can bring for post-COVID recovery. Now, when examining the gender effects of COVID-19, I found it striking that despite the huge attention on job loss in general, and Diego also mentioned that, there's been so little focus on women's jobs. In fact, gender specialists have focused largely on care work and domestic violence, rather than on women's livelihoods and the associated precarities. Now, losing jobs not only affects women's incomes, it can also cause other hardships, such as increase in poverty, food insecurity, indebtedness, asset loss, and of course, rise of violence and even destitution. And what I want to emphasize is that these indirect, often hidden burdens are faced not only by women who have lost their jobs, but also by women who are unpaid workers on family enterprises that have collapsed. So male unemployment also has adverse consequences for female relatives. In other words, gender effects are complex and we need to trace those with care, not least because there are hidden and linked to that pre-existing inequalities. There are also pre-existing social norms, there are shifts, and all of this, what it does is that it's beyond, across households. What happens is it shifts intra-household dynamics and bargaining power. And that is often quite difficult to trace unless we are careful. Now, if you want to measure these complex effects, it's not easy. And I actually, for a recent forthcoming World Development piece, I looked at 23 telephone surveys in India. Now, telephonic surveys have been one of the main ways by which people have been gathering data on the impact of COVID, especially under lockdowns, but even subsequent to that. But what is interesting is that rather few of them disaggregated the information by gender. And most covered basically one aspect of government transfers. In fact, news reports were much better and more diverse. So if you put that together, if you look at the information on telephone surveys, if you look at numerous field reports, then a fairly complex and interesting picture begins to emerge. Empirically, therefore, what I'll do is I'll give you my examples, particularly from India. But of course, there are similar effects in many other countries. As Diego pointed out, there is this north-south dichotomy is perhaps is something that we need to get over. So there is a global south in the north. I mean, if you look at some of the CNN pictures, you find that there are long lines of people waiting for food and food packets. There's hunger and there's poverty. But so there would be issues that I focus on in relation to India, which would have resonance in relation to other countries. Now, what happens when women lose jobs and livelihoods? Of course, immediately they are left much more economically and socially insecure than men. And India, most workers are concentrated in the informal sector, 90% of females, 86% of males, but women have fewer options. So typically rural women work mainly on family farms without pay or as agricultural laborers and artisans, while urban women are concentrated especially in services, from nursing to domestic help to street vending. And then there are some in manufacturing and construction. Now, women who have kept their jobs, such as the frontline health workers, have faced much higher health risks than men. So for instance, 83% of Indian nurses and midwives are female, while 84% of doctors are male. And nurses are found much less likely to get protective gear than doctors, and therefore have been much more at risk of infection. Now, there's not evidence directly for India, but the global 50-50 records show that there are at least 8 for other 8 countries, some of them in Europe, you do find that nurses are found much more at risk of infection. In fact, they have contracted infection much more than men, and there's a kind of medical hierarchy here. Most women, however, have not kept their jobs, and most of them have lost their jobs. So there is a Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, which does an All India survey periodically. And in April 2020, which was just around the beginning of the lockdown in India, and it was a very draconian lockdown, this survey covered 40,000 people. And it showed that while more men than women lost their jobs in absolute terms because of the nature of the job market, women were 20 percentage points less likely to be employed than men among those who were employed pre-lockdown. Now, the sudden lockdown on March 25th also left some 60 million interstate migrant workers, 20% women, stranded and food insecure. In fact, one of the first images and most searing images of, as you would remember, if you looked at this Indian subcontinent, were of millions of migrant workers walking home hundreds of miles, hungry and homeless, and just wanting to return back to their villages. There have been other surveys. A survey in March, April of women across 20 trades found that only 5% were earning anything after lockdown. And those who were running micro enterprises such as bakeries, tailoring, tea stalls reported high or total income loss due to a lack of raw materials and low demand. In urban India, one of the fast growing occupations in recent years has been of domestic help. More than 3 million women working as domestic help in middle-class homes were laid off during lockdown. And many have not been hired back post-lockdown because employers fear infection, and it's called a touch-heavy occupation. So this is really a major setback of what, as I said, has been an important and growing source of urban employment for women. Now, the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, I quoted some figures for April. It redid the survey in August, and it shows that overall women's chances of job recovery are much lower than men's. Income loss has meant increased poverty. Now, of course, as in several other countries, the government in India has been providing cash transfers. It's also been providing food, but that has not been adequate. So for instance, if you take cash transfers, this time, interestingly, they were promised to poor women if they had a particular kind of bank account. But in fact, almost every survey showed that hardly 40 to 50% of the women who were eligible received the cash because they didn't have the particular kind of bank account that was needed for it. So with income loss, what happens is families draw on savings, they take loans, or even sell assets. And this has been happening, but few women have large assets. So if you have a large asset such as land, you could mortgage or sell it. But if you don't have that, you lack the protection that assets can provide. And it also means that you don't have the assets to facilitate economic recovery. Now, although it is true that fewer women than men have died from COVID-19, men's deaths have left their widows more at risk of poverty and social isolation. So we tend not to think, okay, if men have died, report the deaths, but then what happens to their families? And here you find that there are widows in poor households who've been pushed almost to destitution. There's reports of abandonment of women by their families and also social isolation. Even worse, and these are much more recent reports, with deepening poverty has been leading poor families to traffic children into sweatshops, and especially girls have been married off and sold into brothels. So between March and August of 2020, the National Child Line for Distress Calls, which was set up by the Ministry of Women and Child Development, it tracked 22,000 more interventions compared to the same period last year. And of course, as you know, socially, once girls are sold, they are rarely accepted back by families due to social stigma. But the second side part of this is that when men lose jobs, what happens? And ironically, women are more burdened even when men lose jobs because of intra-household gender dynamics, which plays out. So I'll give you some examples. First of all, the return of millions of migrant workers to their villages in India has spread the infection, and female relatives who are, as we know, the main caregivers, are most at risk of exposure. Secondly, unemployment of migrants has sharply cut off remittances. So something like 10% of rural households in India have particularly dependent on remittances. And the burden of making do with less has fallen mainly on women's shoulders. Third, with many returning male migrants seeking work in the villages, women have been crowded out to some extent from the most important government job security scheme. Now, some of you may have even worked on this, that we have the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, NREGA, And this guarantees 100 days of unskilled manual work per rural household annually. And it has given poor women valuable access to independent incomes. But with male crowding, the share of women's work days under NREGA have fallen. Fourthly, of course, women's care work has increased, but this is not just in relation to cooking, as you may hear reports from the global north, but also in the rural areas, it's about fetching water, it's about fetching firewood, which is the single most important cooking fuel still, and it's about fetching other items of daily use. An All India Time Use Survey, which was done, which just came out, it was done in 2019, found that even pre-COVID, males spent only 1.6 hours on average on domestic work, and females 5 hours per day. And this time has now increased. Now, there was a period where, in middle-class homes, you have many friends of mine said, well, their husbands and they are jointly doing the cooking when their maids are no longer there. But I think this has returned back to the pre-lockdown period. Then fifthly, large numbers of rural households report eating less per meal and even skipping meals. Now, since women and girls typically eat last and least, they tend to have fewer calories and proteins. And in poor homes are much more likely to go hungry than boys and men. And of course, as being reported globally in most countries, including in the UK, domestic violence has risen in India. And even in normal times, what's important to recognize is that spousal violence is significantly higher if men are unemployed and women lack independent assets or income. My own research also shows this. So what COVID-19 has done is it's exacerbated this effect. So women have thus carried the burden not only of their own livelihood loss under COVID-19, but also the burdens that arise when their spouses have lost their jobs. But then I want to talk also about the silver lining. And this lies in the pathway that has been opened up by women in agriculture, which was the least affected of other sectors. So for instance, in India, in the first quarter of this financial year, India's GDP contracted by 23.9%, but agriculture grew at 3.4%. And even now, agriculture is growing around 3.4%, whereas all other sectors are still in the negative. So as I've argued in elsewhere, agriculture and the rural sector jointly contribute 46% of India's GDP, and they could jumpstart growth elsewhere. But this will need changing the way we farm, focusing more on livestock, fisheries, and forests, and building a synergy with the wider rural economy. So women have a key role to play in this. First of all, they provide a notable part of the workforce in farms, fisheries, and forests. So suppose we take fisheries. Fisheries employ 13.5 million Indians, 32% are women, and especially aquaculture. In fact, fish is, of course, one of the most important sources of protein globally. Now, in India, in 2017-18, while everything else was contracting or was not doing as well as expected at that point even, fisheries grew at 11.9%. And similarly, women's involvement in forest protection is found to significantly improve forest condition and biodiversity. There was some work I did on community forestry some years ago, which showed that if women were involved in the governance of forests, it significantly improved the likelihood of improvement of forest cover after you control for other factors. But I think the most important thing is that in recent decades, women have led a new model of farming, group farming, which is done much better than individual family farming. So if we recognize that something like 86% of Indian farms are 2 hectares and less, in fact, around 84% of farms across 111 countries are 2 hectares or less. Now, these are too small for tapping scale economies or market opportunities. But what if they pooled land, labor, and capital and farmed it cooperatively in small groups? They could overcome this constraint. Now, this is not just theory. In fact, in India, we have several success stories of group farming. Most important one is of Kerala, which which is in South India. Now, in the early 2000s, Kerala centered its anti-poverty mission on women. It promoted all women group enterprises, especially group farms. And what this involves is basically that 4 to 10 women come together to jointly cultivate leased-in land. They pool their labor and resources. They share costs and returns. And today there are 68,000 such farms. So we're not just talking about 10 farms or 3 farms or 15 farms. We're talking about a very large number, which is 68,000. So when I compared a sample of group and individual farms in 2 districts, I found that the groups had 1.8 times the annual value of output and 5 times the net returns per farm compared to individual family farms, 95% of which were male managed. Now, what is notable is that under COVID, 87% of these groups survived economically, whereas individual farmers, you read numerous reports across newspapers that farmers lost out due to labor shortage or poor market access. In fact, what happened in Kerala was that the women's group farms, when they have sold their vegetables or they donated some of their vegetables to the community kitchens, and there were several thousand community kitchens which were set up to provide food packages and home delivery. So people often say, well, Kerala is rather special, but in fact, one has an answer to that, that you have successful group farming emerging in many parts of the country, in East India, in West India, in Bihar, and North Bengal in the East, in Gujarat in the West, and also in Nepal. So one possibility is that you use what we call self-help groups, which are savings and credit groups. There are 6 million of them, and those could provide a model to potentially take up group enterprises. So Diego's talked about social movements, and I think social movements are of course important, but I feel that what we need to do is build back alternative institutions which rebuild rural communities, which we tend to have this model where development means you move from rural to urban, from agriculture to industry. Well, isn't it time that we rethink that idea? Isn't it possible to look for synergies between agriculture and rural industry, as was being talked about in the 70s and be forgotten? So I feel as we plan ahead, these kinds of examples highlight the critical role that group approaches and networks of local institutions and of communities can play in post-COVID recovery. So on that somewhat more positive note, in a relatively grim picture, let me draw my comments to a close.
Thanks a lot, Bina. I like how you both managed to get something positive at the end, despite 15 minutes being quite negative, I guess, in terms of the impact. But yeah, maybe there is something positive that we could look forward to. But I want to open up the floor to discussions and questions on range of issues. I think we heard a bit more on the macro level from Diego, and then Bina gave us a bit more into the specific mechanisms that we're going to see some of the inequality that Diego spoke about too, especially on issues around gender, but also beyond in terms of agriculture sector. So I think there are a range of issues that we could kind of focus on or discuss. So I'll ask people who have any comments or questions. If you could raise your hand, or if you could write in the chat, I'm happy to read the questions or to give you the floor to ask a question. Okay, Khalid, do you wanna? Yeah, you wanna go, Khalid?
Well, first of all, a huge thanks to Diego and to Bina for some really excellent presentations, and warm fraternal greetings to Diego in having to deal with this crisis as head of department. So something I share with you, so it's been a real challenge. I wanted to pick up on a point that Diego mentioned, which in a sense also kind of connects a little bit to what Bina talked about, which is, in a sense, are we going to look back at this as a fiscal crisis with social consequences, or a social crisis with fiscal consequences? And what Bina was talking about for me was really, well, trying to kind of get our heads around thinking about this as a social crisis, particularly at the household level and in terms of the gender breakdown. But my fear is, given the nature of the political economy around this and the narratives that are being espoused around this, not just in the developed world, but also in much of the developing world, is it not a danger that this will eventually become a fiscal crisis with social consequences? And then how do we address those sets of issues? I mean, Diego, you alluded to social movements as one set of issues that might arise out of this, but in a sense, we have to start thinking about that fiscal space as well. So I just want to throw that back to both of you.
Okay, thanks, Khaled. This issue is quite important, the issue of the fiscal ability or the fiscal crisis that we see. I don't know if Bina or Diego can reflect more on that point.
So let me, I won't put it quite as, it's very neatly put by Khaled, but I'll mess it up a bit. I think I go back to the question, the point where I ended, that if you actually rethink the rural economy, I mean, a large part of the developing world, large parts of sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia are still rural. Agriculture still provides a very important source of income and so on. That this is one of the questions one can ask, since all the other sectors are really doing so badly and you have huge contraction of the economy, can this provide a jump start? So for instance, in India, even before COVID, at least over a year, economists were talking about the lack of aggregate demand, that you can give fiscal stimulus to small business and businesses and so on. They'll produce goods, but who are they going to sell it to if people are not there they don't have the incomes to demand? And there was an interesting expenditure elasticities which were calculated by Maitrish Ghatak at the LSE recently. And what they showed was, with very recent data, this is the same CMIE data, and they showed that if you raise rural incomes and incomes of the poor, you're going to increase demand for local goods, and you're going to increase the poor will spend, the rich save. So it's a familiar argument that if you redistribute income, you're going to increase demand for particular kinds of goods. So I think we need to see it in that sense rather than simply in the macro sense, that how are we going to generate incomes and aggregate demand for the goods that could then provide a means for a multiplier effect of some kind.
Yeah, so thank you, Bina, and thank you for taking the question first. Much appreciated. So I guess I have more questions than answer, Khalid, and some that I'm sure you have thought about yourself. And I think it's useful to divide between the income side and the spending side. Sorry, and I'm going to answer much more at the macro level. And I think in that way, Bina and I will actually reinforce each other in many ways, or complement each other. So I think from the income side, for me, the three questions that are significant are, first, what do we do with debt management? And in particular, what do we do with more cheaper access to private financial markets in today's economy, right? At least, and again, I'm answering from Latin America. One thing that is unique about this crisis versus both the 2008, but especially the 1980s, is access to financial markets. And then you have I think people are discussing or saying two different things about this. One is, oh, we should be very worried about this. The crisis will come sooner or later. But there's another one, which is, if we think that interest rates in the global economy will remain very low for quite a long time, maybe this is an opportunity to try to manage, at least sustainably, but clearly for middle-income countries, an important source. And I think, again, here, countries like Peru, countries like Chile are more interesting than Mexico, which has adopted this policy of total austerity from the beginning. Second big question is how much collaboration in the international economy and in the G20 will change with Biden as president of the US, right? I think this is a more relevant question maybe for low-income countries, which have already had some support, than for middle-income ones, but it's an important one. I remember talking with one of my more neoclassical economists friends at the department in Oxford, and I was very pessimistic about all of these things. And he was saying, well, clearly there's some desire in the IMF to do things differently, and maybe if there's a different political global environment, things might change, right? And then my third big question on the income side is how much in some countries we will see a change in tax policy. And again, I think this might be more important for the middle run, but I think the fact that Argentina has been able to talk about the wealth tax, even if it doesn't increase a lot income in the short run, clearly changes politics in a way that we had not seen in a long time, at least again in my in the region I work on. On the spending side, I think the most interesting change is the realization that many of us knew that talking about targeted programs only in the context of many of the middle income countries we work on does not make any sense. That given that poverty is so fluid and that the lower middle class is suffering so much, supporting some of these groups with cash transfers, for example, but also with access to health is more important than ever. And I do think that we are seeing some changes in those programs that might lead to a very different view, not so much of universalism as for everyone, but much more of programs that we need to cover 50%, 60%, or 70% of the population. So again, I'm not saying that any of this will materialize into a significant creation of policy space. In fact, I'm even pessimistic about the UK, which is not talking about austerity today, but I think it clearly could shift in the space of 12 months. But at the same time, I think there are debates in political economy today that were not present in just 12 months ago. And the question is how we are able to maximize those discussions in both academia, but also in politics.
You know, I just wanted to come in, Shamal, on the wealth tax. And, you know, India has had a wealth tax from 1957. And it's on all kinds of assets that you may have, whether it's your house, your land, your car. I think even if you have heritage paintings. But then what they did was more recently was put a surcharge on income. So people above a certain income, they pay 12% extra on that. It hasn't done much to reduce inequality because large proportions of the population are not taxed. You know, they don't pay taxes. You know, you have informal sector, you have incomes, you have rural incomes, which are not particularly taxed. So the tax base hasn't increased. You might increase tax in the limited number of people who pay taxes. But unless you, so isn't that, I'll there's also a question in the chat which I have to answer, but I wanted to pose it to you, Diego, is that, isn't this an issue in Latin America? You know, or you feel that most of the population has been brought into the tax base.
Can I build on that, Diego? I'm just curious if you're following the case of Argentina, because the wealth tax there was just passed recently. And do you think that's a model that first is going to be, I'm not really following the debates within Argentina, but Argentina has a very difficult debt fiscal history, right? So to what extent do you see this as potentially an effective way, or is that a kind of to actually achieve shift in that? And do you think it might expand within Latin America as a model that dealing with COVID?
Yes, no, I think it's a fascinating issue and with several layers. So first, I totally agree with Vina that here we should separate different reasons why tax levels are not sufficiently high in most Latin American countries, other than Argentina and Brazil. All other Latin American countries have lower tax levels that one would expect based on their GDP per capita. And I think it's for two different reasons. One is exactly what Bina was saying, the extent of the informal sector. So the fact that many people are not paying taxes, but the other is the ability of those at the top to pay very little taxes, right? And obviously, when I was talking about the wealth tax, these are wealth tax on very high income level, so very much on the very rich, instead of trying to adopt a wealth tax on the whole population, which would be more difficult. So for me, at least in the short run, and this might be a disappointing answer, but the symbolic effect of this tax is more important than the revenue impact of this tax. So for all we know, this is only affecting 12,000 people, and they have said that they will charge a higher tax rate to income that is abroad than an income is within the country. But of course, they have no capacity to calculate the income abroad, right? So in that sense, I think the administrative problems are huge, but the symbolic message of we can now start charging the very rich, and we don't buy the argument that this will affect investment and that we should be very worried about it. I think it's very important. And I do think, to your question, Shamel, that it will impose huge pressure on other countries. So for example, Costa Rica had a discussion of having both a wealth tax, and as Bina was saying, a surcharge of income taxes for the very rich, and it didn't, it ended up not implemented it a few months ago, partly because of this neoclassic neoliberal rhetoric that if you do this, you are going to threaten investment and foreign investors will become worried, etc. I think when things don't become that problematic in Argentina, and I think they will not, other governments will start talking about this because of the way the political economy is at the moment. So I guess I'm more enthusiastic about the middle size trend and the path dependence that this can create than the revenue income, the revenue element in the very short run.
Yeah. So the question from Papakita says, group farmers' product has increased, but has COVID has any impact on marketing of these products within and outside India, particularly during lockdown?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. Just before that, I just want to say that this week's Economist, there's one piece which shows that while we've added millions to poverty, the two richest Indians have actually increased their wealth. So so much for the wealth tax. Thank you for this question, Papa. In fact, so the productivity gains of group farming is something that was measured, that I had measured in my research pre-COVID. Now, what is interesting during COVID is that the group farms were able to market their produce. There were various kinds of shortages, particularly during lockdowns. That happened, and part of it was that there was a labor shortage because labor just couldn't move, and then you couldn't get your produce to the market. People couldn't get to the markets, and so on and so forth. So these women were, firstly, because they were cultivating in groups, didn't have a labor shortage. The group itself provided enough labor to market to harvest the fruits and vegetables and so on. And secondly, they found local markets, and the way they did it was, the administration in Kerala calls it a convergence effect, which is that they linked up with the thousands of community kitchens, which were also being run by women. There were some 4.4 million women who were running these. And so the group farmers then were able to sell their produce. The individual farmers suffered a loss because they didn't have they couldn't hire labor in order to harvest the crops. Then there were perishables and they couldn't find the markets. So it's a good question, but what happened during COVID was that those who were in groups were able to make the linkages between higher production and better marketing, whereas those who were individually cultivating were not able to do the same.
Okay. Does that answer your question, Papa? Yeah?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah. May I just add, Shamel, that this idea of a group is not just in relation to farming, because what Kerala has done is actually created what I term a women-centric model of development. And there are group enterprises not just in farming, but they might set up a shop, they might have various other. They offer services jointly. And what you have is therefore a network across the state. And last year, when there were severe floods, it's exactly these hundreds of women who are working in groups who were able to help them get out of there was the cleaning involved, there was reaching out to communities. So what you have is an institutional network which appears to work in a crisis, be it a flood like last year or COVID this year. These groups were also, there were something like, I think, many thousands of WhatsApp groups were set up which were used for contact tracing. So the alternative model is that instead of thinking of ourselves as atomized individuals seeking jobs and so on and so forth, we need to recreate the networks of community and support systems. Now, this is at the local level. I think cooperation is necessary. We talk about cooperation at the international level, and we're talking about cooperation in multiple ways, in terms of vaccines and so on and so forth. But, and I believe that it's at all of those levels that we really, as social scientists, really need to rethink that our individuals going to survive by thinking of ourselves as atomized and competitive? Or is there some truth that we also have a strong spirit of social cooperation on which we can build?
Okay, so I have a question for you, Diego, but I'll start with Roshan. So Roshan, I have a question. So do you want to say your question, Roshan?
Sorry, can you hear me, Shamel?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, great. All right. And I had a question for Bina, touching back on the dynamics around return migration and the impacts that it's going to have. So I work in Nepal, and like you said, it's a huge problem in Nepal. We had around 9-10 million people return back home since this crisis started. And before the crisis, as you mentioned, we have evidence that farmer and water user association groups that were led by women were faring better than those led by men. And the same thing applied to forestry as well. Going back in rural agriculture and forestry, among other sectors, decreasing due to the reduction in remittance, and then men coming into the mix of what sort of was, were well-functioning institutions. How do you think we deal with this? What is the way forward, sort of? I'm imagining a situation where the recession in the Middle East gets, just keeps getting worse. Men stay in villages. There's no money due to lack of remittance, and then there's some restructuring in the local institutions in the rural decision making. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
I think what you see will happen, once the vaccines have come in and people have started returning, that people will return, I think, to some degree, but not to the same extent. So whether it's international travel, people going from, say, Nepal and India to the Middle East, in Kerala, it's a very important part of the economy is the remittance incomes, or whether it is from rural areas to urban areas. Both of those will revive up to a point. I haven't looked at international migration in any detail, but internal migration, you do find a fair proportion of people are returning, but not everybody is returning. And the question is, does everybody need to return? Here's some figures. Just going back to a point I'd made earlier. If you take agriculture, it's 15% of India's GDP. 15 to 16%. And I'm sure it's the same in, if you take Latin America and so on, the proportion of agriculture in GDP is declining. The population isn't declining. You still have 60 to 70% of the population in agriculture. But the rural sector is not just agriculture. So for instance, in India, 60 to 61% of incomes of rural families come from the non-farm sector. And so what is the non-farm sector, rural sector actually is very diverse. It has everything from food industries to machine tools to large medium-sized enterprises. It has people in the salary sector, it has informal workers, and it has the self-employed. So it's very diverse. And the kind of synergy which could take place between agriculture, fisheries, and forest, treated as an integrated system, with the other part of the rural economy. I think those are the synergies that we haven't actually explored enough. So agro-industry is a big area. As I said, machine tools is another area. There's ecotourism, there's farm tourism. There's a variety of services, health and education. So we're all going to be talking about better health systems post-COVID. And improvement in health systems, I think, have a huge potential for increasing employment, as does the education sector. So all of these need fixing. They've already needed fixing pre-COVID, but I think all of them need fixing even more in South Asia. And I see that those would be the areas which could absorb some of the younger people who don't want to sit and soil their hands in farming, but would certainly may not want to go back to cities, and live as aliens in cluttered urban or semi-urban, semi-slum conditions. And it seems to me we need to make that happen.
Okay, thanks, Bina. I have a question for you, Diego. So you spoke a bit about, we discussed already a bit on the fiscal side of the issue. I think for a lot of economists after 2008, the argument was that we entered a new sort of world economy, in the sense of, especially in Europe, the role of the ECB in quantitative easing and in buying government debt and all these processes. And recently, from a few articles I've read, we've seen kind of globalization of that model. So a lot of developing countries now have moved into a similar practice of buying government debt through central banks in a more direct way than before. I don't know if you're following that issue at all, and if you're following it, do you think, because in the case maybe of Europe, the ability of central banks and institutions to raise taxation going forward to cover that is relatively higher, but in lower capacity to tax more in developing countries, do you think we're facing a fiscal crisis and a fiscal debt crisis that could be as big as earlier crises that we've seen in many countries? Or do you think there's something fundamentally kind of different about the global economy today? Yeah.
Yes, so let me answer that and also make a small reference or continue the conversation with Bina about this issue of the rural and non-rural, which I think is fascinating. So on this issue, I have almost a contradictory reaction. So the first is I still remain unclear about what is the meaning of the huge liquidity in global financial markets, private markets, and interest rates that are so low in comparative perspective, right? Because on the one hand, and I'm thinking about Latin America to be clear. On the one hand, my first reaction is liquidity is here to stay for the next 5 to 10 years. 5 years, say, I don't see any change in central banks in the global north that would lead to the type of shock that we saw in 1980, 81, right? There's no inflation, that's not where the pressures are. And if that's the case, and if you have risk premiums that are so low, what exactly you should be doing in terms of access to financial markets is very complicated to answer for me. And if I was a finance minister at the moment, I would struggle exactly with that question. Because on the one hand, all your history says be very careful because this might not be sustainable very soon. But at the same time, the issue of liquidity and central bank policy in the global north indicates something differently. On the second, I think my answer is easier, which is I think many Latin American countries will be much more careful to make that type of policy that you are saying, which is basically about, at the end, is about expanding monetary policy because of its history, right? I don't think the region has forgotten the impact of hyperinflation that took place in the 1980s and early 1990s, which, remember, had implications not just on the rich, but also on the poor, right? And Brazil is the best example of how that is in the imagination. So in a way, I think it's the same type of social imagination effect that we see still in Germany with inflation. And there's a lot of work on history and political economy about what hyperinflation did on the long run. I think that's the same in Latin America. So I don't think that will be a response, even if probably economically it made sense. I think it will be complicated, the latter one. I guess to create a conversation, for me, the two issues that are so interesting on what Bina is saying. The first is that the issue of connected versus unconnected economies, right? And I did work in the past on linkages, following the work of Stephanie Barrientos and others. And there, of course, the issue of linkages is very important. And in a way, I think, and there were very few, but I think what you are saying is we should take a look at a different type of linkages, right? Which is not about exports, but about other parts of the economy. And I think this is very relevant, as you were saying, not just for South Asia, but also for Latin America. I guess the difference in Latin America is one of size, and is what you were saying about the urban versus non-urban sector. Latin America is 80% urban today, right? So in a way, the rural development side will be extremely important, especially for poverty, but less in terms of macroeconomic impact as compared, I think, as compared to South Asia. And I guess my overall message is it's still how interesting it's these comparisons between what is similar and different between different regions, and how little of those we do. I'm always surprised of how little of big comparisons between different parts of, especially Latin America in particular, with other parts we do. I think comparisons with India and comparisons with South Africa, for example, there are a few.
Thanks, Diego. You know, it's true. I mean, obviously, Latin America is hugely more urbanized. But what struck me, you know, I was in Brazil in 2012, and the MST people, I wanted to visit some of the regions. So there was a group of agroecologists who took me to Minas Gerais, and we traveled for many days. And we met with people, this is the landless workers movement in Brazil, who were in varying degrees of success, had been able to get back the land from the large cifandias under the Brazilian constitution, which allowed you to take back land for social purpose. It was, I was struck by the fact that there was a return. It wasn't huge. I don't know what the numbers were, but there was a desire to come back to the land if they had the land. And there were, you know, people were being able to invest in the land by borrowing from relatives and communities to set up agroecological farms, which are much more viable than the tiny sort of monocultural cropping patterns that had existed. So while when you talk about social movements, then there is, I mean, after all, both MST and Via Campesina have their origins in Latin America. Via Campesina has become, as you would know, one of the biggest movements for food sovereignty globally, and it's on the backs of that we see the pushback and the conversation around alternative food systems. But I'm saying a little more than that. I'm saying it's not just about alternative foods; it's also about the institutional networks and the mechanisms by which you produce that, produce food. So I think here you do have in the North, I mean, you began with we shouldn't be dividing North and South, you know, the idea of reaching out to communities, the getting local farmers produce, different ways by which people want to link back. It's a kind of a different vision of what society could be. And somehow in our macro discussions, we miss out on what people experience as real well-being and what makes for real well-being. So I wanted your response on that.
Before that, I have two questions from one to Bina and one to Diego. So the question to you, Diego, from Giovanni Pasquali is on regional integration in Latin America. So he's saying what we've seen in last 2 weeks in Africa, kind of a push to speed up regional integration within the ACFTA. Is there any sort of trend you see in Latin America for regionalization, economically or politically? Is this likely to happen, or could that be a good way to deal with issues around inequality or the debt issues maybe? The question to Bina is the final question I think we have to conclude after, is from Papa about remittances. So remittances sent to households from people in diaspora is quite huge and help a lot of households in developing countries. Did your research find out an impact of COVID on remittances for households in India, particularly women? So I'll give you, Diego, final 2 minutes to answer that question, and then Bina similarly, and then we could conclude the discussion.
Perfect.
Diego,
Thank you so much. And a couple of reactions to both this question and then to I think the very interesting discussion from Bina. So on this question, the answer is not at this point. And I think there would be many reasons to explain why, but then we could summarize with one, which is called Bolsonaro. I think historically in Latin America, Brazil is an important player, given its size, to see whether regional integration takes place. I'm thinking about South America, of course, or it doesn't. And Bolsonaro has been very uninterested in many good things, but one of the many good things he has been uninterested in is in exploring mode of the regional integration. And that has meant very little advance. So while the mid to late 2000s, the moment of the commodity boom, were a moment of a lot of enthusiasm, the last 5 to 6 years it hasn't happened. And I don't think it will change, at least for the next one or two. I'm actually not sure that economically it would make a huge difference, but obviously politically, I think a more joint integration would be important. On Bina's point, I fully agree on the need to rethink the economy, and that passes for a different relationship to the land. And I think you are totally right that Latin American movements and ideas have been very prevalent here. I guess, and don't hate me for this, I guess for me, the other interesting thing is, of course, the link between those movements at the micro level and the macro. And this is where I do think that maybe in parts of South Asia, the link is much clearer, right? Because the economic importance of the rural economy is so much larger that by reinventing the rural spaces, you are going to reinvent also the macroeconomy, almost by definition, which I think maybe in some Latin American countries, that link is more complicated. And therefore, we also need to think more creatively about how we rethink the cities and not just the rural spaces.
Mm-hmm. Bina?
Thank you. Papa's question about remittances, well, what we know is that remittances have, of course, dried up at the moment. People will have savings from past remittances. It's too early to tell what the long-term effect might be. But if smaller remittances, when they stop, means that the household therefore would fall back on savings, then the next stage could be selling of assets and so on. So essentially, therefore, what we need to think about is the resilience of households and the economy, and is it able to recover? How far down that slope does it go? I think we don't have enough data for the moment beyond those very general comments. I want to thank you, Diego. This is really going to be, of course, future conversations, hopefully partly also in Oxford. But I just want to put in this additional point that the way we think of micro and macro, in terms of institutions, perhaps again we need to rethink them, because people say, well, that's only those are small groups, there are some examples, how do you scale up? Now, scaling up doesn't mean that a group of 5 should become a group of 50,000. There are other ways of scaling up. And I think here is Elinor Ostrom's work is really useful, because what she talked about was nested communities. And the institutional focus is that you can have small groups, and then you scale up by federations, federated structures. So you have much more of a honeybee kind of, or rather like a pyramid. I'll give you one example, which is very useful here, is Nepal. Now, Nepal has hundreds and hundreds of forest user groups, some of them quite small across the country, but it has a national level federation. And the way it is linked up is the way we link up democratically, from choosing local, electing local leaders, and then having representatives which go up all the way. And so similarly, they built up a country level federation. And so I think somewhere we need to see these institutional structures as building blocks which can move from the local to the national and beyond. And for me, that's also a part of the linking of the micro and the macro.
Okay, on that note, I think we're a few minutes over time. So I'd like to thank you. Hopefully everybody would join me in thanking you, Bina and Diego, for a very, very interesting session.